many years, because she's still a very young lady. And Jade, hopefully, as you know, this is the last fireside chat. I'll be bold enough to say we've left best for last.
Sure.
So maybe just a little bit about Jade, and then I'll hand over to her. Jade completed a Bachelor of Science degree in Market and Economics and Statistics from South Africa. She's an incredibly well-read and versed individual, then went off to Italy and studied Italian, late Renaissance art, history of opera and painting restoration, and then had this real love and view that Asia was definitely the place to be, wanted to learn more about business, and went to NUS and completed her executive MBA. In terms of her work curriculum, Jade was, I guess, one of the earlier pioneers when it comes to ESG, having joined Deloitte back in 2010. And she got involved in the very early days, understanding how carbon credits. She led projects for Deloitte on carbon credits. Then joined Building Energy South Africa as a senior development manager. Moved then on to the Renew Power Group. Then joined an organization that I was involved in. I'm involved in the smaller organization where I had the privilege of working with Jade for about 2.5 years, which Jade led a number of initiatives through the region, including our Path to Purpose, which really drove to make us a more sustainable and equitable organization across a number of channels, across 11 odd markets. And today she is the Vice President of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance at Singapore Stock Exchange. She's also a part-time guest lecturer at NUS. So I think we have one of the young, smart brains and somebody that will forge mankind's future as we go forward. So I'm really honored to have Jade speak to us this afternoon. It is going to be a fireside chat, which means that the floor is open afterwards, and I'm sure Jade would be happy to answer any and all questions posed to her. So Jade, a warm welcome. Thank you for getting up some time this afternoon.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here. Appreciate it.
And my apologies to all. I had the privilege of coming to South Africa to see my colleagues. Actually a farewell, because I've decided after 20 years to leave my organization and start my own, as in business, not organization yet. That's a bit too ambitious at this point. And one of my farewell gifts from South Africa was COVID. So I'm in the tail end of just trying to recover and fly back tomorrow. So Jade, once again, thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. I think what would be interesting if we start with the current, if you could maybe just share a little bit about what your role currently is, what you're currently doing at SGX.
Sure. Nice to meet everybody. Thank you for having me. So currently at SGX, I'm the VP, as Sean said, of Sustainability and Sustainable Finance. And how we divide that up is one is the sustainability part and the other is the sustainable finance part. So if you think of SGX as a Parthenon, the sustainability part covers the roof just below the CEO and CFO's office. So what that means is that we work on all sustainability strategies for SGX as a company, from the climate target setting, any decarbonisation ambitions, the sustainability report, which for better or worse is my baby for the next 2 months. So that's integrating all the units throughout SGX to develop the sustainability report, and any thought leadership that comes from SGX as a company. Then we've got the sustainable finance component. If you think about all the different pillars, so Singapore Exchange is a multi-asset exchange. We cover commodity derivatives, equity derivatives, indices, etc. So we work with all the different asset classes from a sustainable finance perspective to develop products that are relevant for the market. So my newly released baby that got launched at the end of April was the OCBC low carbon product. And that we worked with OCBC and Lion Global to develop the first low carbon product relevant to the Singapore economy that looked at real and financial organizations within a Singapore context. So any organization that was domiciled or incorporated in Singapore, but even if it's listed in New York or London or Hong Kong, etc., could come into the product. So that was quite an innovative product. So we work across the organization as our team. I would say the only part we don't really work on is the regulatory side. So there's a Chinese wall between us as a company and as a business, and as the regulator. Given we are a company listed on our own exchange, there does need to be a little bit of independence between the two. But we do consult with the regulators, particularly in terms of the regulations that are coming out of the US and Europe, and how that could potentially influence our markets in Singapore and the rest of Asia Pacific. So that's a little bit about my role.
Thanks, Jade. I mean, that's very comprehensive. It feels like you're having to do multiple things. I guess you're never going to get away from the sustainability report, because I think you had a hand in developing the Smaller Group sustainability report.
Yes.
Jade, ESG, you know, there's been a lot around ESG. I see Elon Musk this week had quite a lot to say around ESG. But it'd be really good if you could help us define what ESG really means, and how ESG has evolved. So if I can leave that with you to maybe just help us understand that.
Sure. I'm going to go quite far back, I guess, to set where it comes from. So originally this was known as corporate social responsibility, and it has its roots in the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution led to a reorganization of society around corporations. And in the late 19th and 20th century, it was often viewed as a period of corporate irresponsibility, producing mass work or exploitation, unsafe working conditions, excessive pollution, etc. And yet, successful early industrialists recognized the necessity for corporate responsibility, leading organizations to have healthy employees creates improved productivity and therefore improved profits. So what is sustainability if we bring it into, I guess, today's context? Broadly, it's defined as meeting our own needs without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And if I take it from a financial perspective, if we look at the accounting principle of what it means to be a going concern, it is the assumption that an entity will remain in business for the foreseeable future. So bringing it to 2022 and into the sustainability context of companies across all sectors, it's the need to focus on the potential implication of risk related to climate and nature and social and governance factors to ensure that they are going concern for the next decades, 100 years. If we just look at Rotary, I think Rotary is, if I looked at the website, 110 years old or something along those lines. And that's a sustainable organization. How did it stay innovative and relevant over the last 100 years? Sustainability is that relevance and ensuring that the impact that you're having on society and the impact that the society is having on you is sustainable. And this concept is actually called double materiality, which is quite a buzzword in the industry at the moment. So going to ESG, environmental social governance, which is now really taken off. I think I say COVID was a blessing for sustainability. I've been in this industry for 13 years and I've never seen the private sector rally around sustainability like it is now. I think the pandemic showed that the implications that nature has on us as human beings and as a society is quite profound. And it really brought into awareness how and what we should be doing about that. So the story of ESG investing began actually in January 2004, when the former UN Secretary Kofi Annan wrote to over 50 CEOs of major financial institutions, inviting them to participate in a joint initiative under the UN Global Compact. And this then led on to how to make the initiative was to find ways to integrate ESG into capital markets, a case to make good business, so it made good business sense, to lead it to more sustainable markets and therefore better outcomes for society. So the concept of ESG in the industry now is slightly evolving. So currently the conversation is largely from the environmental standpoint around carbon and decarbonization and net zero targets and what that means, and carbon credits is quite a buzz trend at the moment. But that means that the environmental, so the E, is actually now just a big C. And the evolution conversation now is happening around nature. What happens to nature? Because the atmosphere is actually just one realm of nature, and that's where the carbon forms. And then you've got the water and the land, etc. So what's happening now around E, S, and G is this nexus. How does the environmental aspects influence the social aspects? And then how does that influence how corporations, government, etc. govern? And how do those all link together? So that's where the next conversation's coming. Unfortunately, sustainability is an area that is moving very, very quickly. And as practitioners in the space, we probably running, 5, 10, 15 years ahead and trying to still make sure that all the corporations, societies, governments are on that same journey. So we innovate and then we capacity build, I guess, to keep everybody up to date. But the nexus conversation is where things are coming, I guess, within the next 5 years. Asia is a little bit behind what I would say Europe is. Europe is quite advanced. They've had carbon markets for probably 12 years. They're looking at social taxonomies now. So we keep a very, very close eye on what is happening in Europe, because that will start to influence what's happened, and how we do things in Asia. So lots of information, but that's, I guess, where things are, and where they're moving to.
I think that's amazing. I mean, when I think of ESG, honestly, I think of it in less than decades or decade. If I think of corporate social responsibility, maybe I think in a decade or two, maybe. What you've taken us back is to the very, very, very start, where this realization was being a responsible employer, well-being of employees and the communities in which you operate in is a good, sound business principle. I think, Kofi Annan should be saluted, and he certainly has been and was. It's amazing. So, Jade, thanks for that. I thought that was a really interesting history lesson. The fact that Asia is running slightly behind, and if I think of how much production actually takes place in Asia and how many people we have across Asia Major, there really is a case for organizations to accelerate their best thinking. Talking about thinking, I mean, there's been some real advocates out there. Paul Polman, who was, I think they called him Captain Environment. I think Time magazine had a picture of Paul Polman on the front, ex-CEO of Unilever, who really transitioned and moved the Unilever organization to become a more aware organization, an organization that truly cared for communities, environments. And he subsequently left, started his own business, and wrote his last book, which I think was called Net Zero.
Yes.
Any views on what Paul Polman's thinking is around, or Bill Gates is thinking?
It's interesting. Both of them are, Microsoft, Unilever. And Paul Polman was one of the innovators in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. He was one of those who developed them. So he was way ahead of his time and working with organizations to really forward think. And what's been interesting is Unilever's come under a lot of pressure, because what Paul Polman did is he said, well, we need to be socially responsible. And how do we do that? We innovate in our packaging, our supply chains, our employee practices, etc. And some of his shareholders in the last year have turned around and said, well, why aren't we getting our returns? We care about the profit. It's all good and well that you're trying to save the world, but where's our money, right? And I think that's very interesting in the sustainability conversation, because the questions we always get asked is, well, if I invest in this, why am I not getting the performance? And where Paul Polman, and I guess somewhere like Bill Gates as well, is interesting, is that they think of this as a long term, the circular economy concept. If we if we carry on mining our resources, there's going to be nothing left to mine. And I think if we bring it into today, the Ukraine crisis is a perfect point. We're heading for a food crisis, which is then going to create, great social crisis. And what does that do then to the economics coming out of the COVID pandemic? So where Paul Polman and Bill Gates really notice it, and Bill Gates is working with an epidemiologist called Larry Brilliant, which is quite an apt name, who eradicated smallpox. And one of the observations was that outbreaks are inevitable from a nature perspective. There's always going to be outbreaks, but pandemics are optional because that's the human impact. And where Paul Polman and Bill Gates thinking is, this is a long-term strategic imperative. This is a sustainable going concern of humanity. And until we realize that nexus, that, social, environmental nexus of how things relate and how our behavior relates, I think, we can't move forward as a society and be a going concern as a human race.
Wow, I mean, I guess the knock-ons and ramifications of, or unintended consequences of decisions made are far-reaching. So I guess there is a case for ESG. Why do you think it really matters?
So it's okay. So why does it really matter? I feel it really matters. So like Sean, I'm South African. I got brought up in a country which is so polarized. We've got, very third world aspects, and then we've got incredible first world aspects. And for me, I just felt like it was my, natural human imperative that I should look after the space that I've been given. If I destroy this piece of land that I've been given, who's going to maintain it going forward? And for better or worse, regulation has slowly caught up. It's taken some time, but it has caught up. And corporates are now realizing that, for example, I don't know, Coca-Cola, for example, if they don't have water, they don't have a product. If they don't have a product, they go out of business. So how do they make sure that their water resource is clean and can be used for their production? But that's not only just Coca-Cola. What happens upstream? So if there's a cement facility upstream and they're polluting the water, and that comes down into Coca-Cola. So you start to see this whole ecosystem developing, that if you become an irresponsible individual, why should somebody else look after the resource for you? So the conversation is getting more and more ecosystem impact, which I think is becoming interesting. How governments work with financial institutions, work with corporates, and COP26, which happened last year in November, was quite profound, because that's the conversation that's been had. Corporates are being put under a lot of pressure, particularly from a disclosure perspective, from consumers, from investors, from governments around what they're doing and how are they using the ecosystem that they've been provided in the various countries. And we're going from climate, which is it's atmospheric. You can offset whatever you do in Australia. You can buy credits in the US, and, atmosphere is atmosphere. But it's going down now into the granularity of nature, and how do you disclose on your biodiversity and your nature impacts? And that starts to become a lot more complicated. So for corporates, it's incredibly important to recognize their human impact, their environmental impact, and what that means for them as a business. And again, going back into the financial terminology, material risk and material opportunity. Any business which isn't looking at what's material to you and material to make sure that you continue on in the future, you're not running a very good business.
Jade, this whole notion of carbon credits and the ability to buy offsets, how is that responsible? Because it feels like you just write in a check and then you're a greenie.
Yeah. So carbon credits, so there's a something called the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And what that does is it validates. So all these corporates who are going net zero and making these big ambitions to decarbonize, they validate their targets to actually make sure what they're saying is not greenwashing. And as part of this decarbonization journey, SGX actually brought out a white paper last year, which talks about the 6 steps. And carbon credits under the Science-Based Targets Initiative are not part of their decarbonization target setting. So once you've, reduced your electricity, for example, once you've, gone to the bare bones of what you can physically do, sometimes there's this little piece which you can't change and reduce, then you can buy carbon credits. And what the discussion then is what is a good carbon credit? There's a concept of additionality. So if a project was going to go ahead, regardless of, financing, etc., and it's a profitable business, then you shouldn't be able to get a carbon credit for that. So there's a lot of conversation around this in the industry around these decarbonization targets and what that means. And just not writing off checks and just buying carbon credits just to, say that you're going carbon neutral, because you actually need to be creating a better environment and using less resources versus just buying from somewhere else. So as an example in this case, so there's reforestation credits. What some places were doing is actually cutting down the trees to replant the trees to get the carbon credits and make a profit. So there's a lot of contention with how things are working, and really trying to plug the gaps and see where the issues are and try to fix them.
I guess mankind has always been innovative, and I don't necessarily mean in the most positive sense. Is there such a thing as a carbon police force, a carbon watchdog? I mean, to cut down forests to replant to get credits.
Yeah.
That's morally corrupt.
Yeah.
Economically corrupt.
What's great now is we've got satellites, and satellites, it's very hard to get around. So even if you go as auditors, so I actually started my career as a carbon credit auditor. And we used to go there and see what was happening on the ground and check things out. But it's very hard when you've got acres and acres and acres of forests. But now with satellites, it's very hard to get around some of these things, which is good. So there we go. We've got our police force up in the sky.
So as organizations pivot their bow towards this continued ESG journey, what should they be thinking about?
I think it's multifold. At the moment, people are really considering their decarbonization journey, and that is quite complex. So, you can't really change how you buy electricity unless you're going to really go fully off the grid. But in Singapore, we're very lucky. They are very serious about decarbonization. We don't have coal power. They're looking at solar. They're looking at renewables. They're looking at gas. So gas is probably going to be the next transition. This discussion around transition financing and going from coal to gas to renewables. And then in the supply chain, the next one is looking at your scope 3 emissions. So what are your suppliers doing? Are you getting a mining product? So as electric vehicles start to take off, where's your copper and nickel and cobalt coming from? And how does that go into the social practices of the lives of people in the mines, as an example? It's quite a matrix, but I think if you just look at your 4 walls and see what you can do within your business, in your 4 walls. So Woolworths, for example, in Australia, all their shops that they can control will be fully renewable energy in the next couple of years. They've also started interacting quite heavily with their suppliers on packaging. How do they either have sustainable packaging that's easily recyclable, or they've got a product, a service, where they deliver you your washing powders, your cleaning products, your foods in bottles, and you call them, they come pick up the bottles, they refill them, and they deliver them back to you a few days later. So they've developed the system, I think it's called Loop, where they've said, okay, well, we need people to buy our products, but how do we make this more environmentally friendly? And they're looking for innovative ways. So I guess that's one example.
Yes, it's becoming, I know, to be consciously clean and green comes at a cost. You know, when I think of sustainable products that I like to buy, typically more expensive. And I think corporates have this pressure that comes from shareholders, stakeholders to say, and I mean, your case in point was Unilever, where Alan Job's under a lot of pressure, not I think because of Paul Pullman, but just because of the nature of the business and the evolution, where shareholders are saying we want more return. How long before sustainable becomes economically viable?
So I saw it in solar. So when we were buying our solar panels, the costs were pretty crazy. And within a few years, they dropped below $1. So I think they were at like 50 cents because they were being mass produced and the economies of scale dropped. So it will get there. The more we're on this journey, the more innovation that takes place, the more technology that comes in. I think what's very interesting in the space is the climate tech that's happening, the agri-tech that's happening. Technology really does bring the costs of things down. And the more that consumers demand it, the more corporates have an incentive to do it. I think until it's either regulatory pushed at the moment or it's consumer pushed. Unfortunately, corporates are profit driven because they've got shareholders to answer to. And unless the shareholders are really, and the investors are really pushing for this, it is tough to change, and it's slow to change. It's very slow to change your manufacturing processes overnight to make things that are sustainable. But it's also human behavior. And how do humans who have been taught over the Industrial Revolution 100 years to consume, how do you change behavior that maybe you don't need that extra pair of shoes for you know that function? But yes, it's not an easy one to change, but it has shown that it's getting there. And I think the cost of products are starting to come down.
You know, Jade, you spoke about the regulator, and there's this interplay between government, corporate, and society. What role does the regulator really play? And how much teeth does the regulator really have?
Sorry, what was the last part?
Sorry, you spoke about the regulator, and I'm keen to understand, you know, what role does the regulator play between government, corporates, and society? So
I can talk in Singapore context and maybe a bit in Europe. So we, at the SGX regulator, which is one of the financial regulators, together with MAS, etc., work very closely to monitor what's happening globally, the global conversations, because I think what's quite important is the market isn't always ready for some of the things that need to happen. So Europe, for example, is very advanced, and the regulation that is coming out of Europe is very advanced. It does have implications on, for example, Asia, because we are a big supplier to the various markets around the world. And what Europe now is looking at is cross-border. And what does that do to supply coming out of Asia if Asia isn't ready to provide, you know, a carbon footprint of a product, etc., and then they get taxed. But what Singapore brought out in February in the budget speech was the carbon tax. And now they're looking at how do they tax over the next few years, and the regulation will come out. Various industry players, how does that become offset? What does the cost look like to the economy? So they're socializing this concept. But even before that, the Singapore exchange, for all companies listed on the exchange, they started to have to disclose on what we call Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosures. And that's their decarbonisation journey, the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. So even before we get to the carbon tax, the corporations in Singapore are starting to consider this, so that the time the carbon tax really comes into play, hopefully they're ready. So I think there's this important nexus that's happening between the governments and the regulators, and the timing. I think the timing is very important. rules also just came out in New York under the SEC on climate. There's a public consultation out at the moment. But this is all starting to get standardized. So where the industry is moving from a regulation perspective is standardization. So there's a whole bunch of different frameworks, a whole bunch of different standards, all with their own acronyms, which gets very confusing. But they are all starting to become standardized under the IFRS Foundation, which we all know as the accounting principles. And that will really change things, because then everybody starts talking the same language. Maybe not the Americans so much just yet under GAAP, but the rest of us will be talking the same language. And I think that's very, very important, because that's driven by the private sector, but it does have the G7, G20 backing of those kind of initiatives as well.
Jade, look, I think this has been fascinating, and thank you for answering my questions. What I would often propose is that anyone on the call, if they've got any questions, let's open it to the group, and I'm sure we'll all gain from your experience or views. So, Snali, if I could open the floor.
Yes.
And, start fielding some questions for Jade.
I think Julia and PP Allen have both raised their hands. So, okay. PP Allen, you want to start?
Okay, can I just check that what are the common challenges that big corporations face in actually implementing ESG? I mean, is there any some common challenges that company face, big corporation face in implementing all this ESG stuff?
I think it's capacity, it's resources, and knowledge. There's quite a shortage of knowledge, not because there's not enough to read. There's a lot to read, but the industry is moving very quickly. So it's trying to keep up pace with what's happening. And obviously greenwashing is a concern. And how do you make sure that you're not doing something that then is going to be seen as greenwashing? Because then the reputational implications and sometimes even now the legal implications of that are incredibly serious. Greenwashing in France is a I think prisonable offense now. So I think that's the concern, is that sometimes you have to do something, but there's this fear of doing the wrong thing and trying to then get the resources and capacity building and knowledge to do the right thing. So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges at the moment.
Thank you. Thank you.
Julia, you want to go ahead and ask?
Hello, everyone. I have actually two questions. The first one is, are there international incentives for the transformation to the green production? Because as just now it was mentioned that conversion is not easy. It may be very costly for some companies, and it may take time. And I believe for the economies. And Asia is probably more in need this part, because most of the countries are developing countries, not like very long industrialized experience like Europe. So since international organizations providing a lot of grants and credits to support the developing countries, is there such facilities like for transformation of this production styles? That's my first question. Then second question is, I read somewhere that I don't know how is your view, that some areas are benefited global warming, which then they become like reluctant. For example, I am in a very cold place and I cannot use the soil for agriculture. But there's no more snow, or less snow, I can create an agriculture, or more people can live. So is there such like a conflict of interest on this issue? I mean, it could be areas, could be for the companies, and this kind of conflict of interest, what kind of solutions could be provided? I mean, being very conscious and it will affect everyone is very important. But is there any ideas or any developments on this issue?
So I'll start with the first one, but the last one was very interesting. So out of COP26, and there's an organization called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. One of their pillars is actually to mobilize capital to developing countries. So from the developed world to the developing countries. It's always been an issue. And I worked in Africa, and trying to get capital is not easy when you're dealing with corrupt governments and currency risk, and the economics are tough. One of the things from a developing country perspective is Indonesia and Singapore just signed an agreement for carbon markets. And I thought that was incredibly forward thinking and very innovative, because you've got Singapore, which is a compliant, regulatory, well-governed market. And then you've got Indonesia, which has been notoriously difficult to work in. And they're now starting to form partnerships to work together. So you trust from your investment perspective Singapore, and then you invest in Asia, in Indonesia. So there are ways that they're looking to do that. I know an ex-colleague of mine in renewable energy. So mobilizing capital to South Africa and Africa has also been quite difficult for these reasons, unless you're going through one of the development banks. And the UK and the Norwegian government just gave them $60 million for their renewable energy facilities. So they are finding ways to do this other than the traditional grant funding that comes out of all the governments, because mobilizing capital to the developing world is incredibly important. And I think we saw that in COVID as well. So it is happening. There's a long way to go, particularly because the financial institutions and their due diligence, the risks, they don't always necessarily have the risk appetite. But it's changing, baby steps, and it's getting there, and people are finding innovative ways to do it. I think your second point was quite interesting. I've never thought about it that way, but you're absolutely right. Some places are going to get incredibly hot for the worse, and other places are going to get potentially warmer, maybe for the better, because they can use the agriculture. Scientists are doing a lot of modeling on floodlines. They're doing a lot of modeling on the climate to see how things change. The problem is that humans have settled in places where it's been good for their social livelihood. So you're going to have mass migration, and we're not quite sure what that looks like. So the coastal regions will flood. The human population will move inland, and we're not quite sure if that inland natural diversity will be good for the human population to settle in, or we're going to have crises, food crises will happen. So we're not quite sure what that balance will look like as sea levels rise, as climates change. So it's interesting point, which I might have to give a little bit more thought to.
Thank you. On only one more subject also about taxing. Is there any tax incentives the companies converting their production system or adding that the environmentally conscious means? Do they get rewarded as well, like by taxing grants or things like that?
I think the innovation grants. So if there's something innovative and new, I think you get innovation grants. I don't believe I've seen an environmental tax benefit. I don't know if I've seen that, but what I have seen is there are certain innovation benefits, which you can then relate to environmental, but I don't think it's a very straightforward way of getting tax benefits, unfortunately.
For example, if I'm a company and I see my company is causing some environmental problem, or it's not very environmentally friendly. So I decided to change the production system that it become environmentally friendly. Mm-hmm. But for a company, this is could be a significant cost, especially if it's a small company. So taking this cost to live for a company, or just go on as it is and continue to be alive and making profit. So there can be a choice in between, depends on the situation. But like if there's a significant change towards the environmentally positive production system, if someone tried to do this, will there be a tax reward? Could there be?
How people are seeing the reward is that if you don't do it, you're probably going to you're not going to be in business for very long, because let's just use Unilever. Unilever if you're an SME, and this is where SMEs really are having the challenge, and we're having a lot of conversations with SMEs, they can't afford to do some of these decarbonization projects that they need to innovate. They're not necessarily getting the funding. So MAS does have some grants where you can apply, and if you meet the criteria, you obviously will get the funding. But the biggest implication is that the corporations will stop buying from you because they will look for a more sustainable supplier. That is the risk that you face. So you need to then look at your operations and decide, is this sort of R&D budget to innovate and upskill, to change your manufacturing process worth it, or do you go out of business? So it's definitely not an easy one, and SMEs are really struggling with it, very much so.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, yeah.
Thank you.
Vivek, yeah. Vivek, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just a couple of observations. I think sustainability is not a matter of good to have. I think it's a must have, especially for listed companies. I think a lot of pension funds, when they invest their money, they make it a requirement for all the fund managers to ensure that the companies that they invest in are sustainable or have sustainable practices or credentials. Secondly, I think there's a Dow Jones Sustainability Index. So if you are rated well on that index, then that becomes a huge plus for shareholder investments. I think the third point is that I think if you're in a consumer business, the millennials are so concerned about the environment and climate that if you are not sustainable, there's a risk that your products get boycotted. And on the flip side, if you have strong sustainability credentials, then your products they get a leg up with the millennial generation. So I think it's not a matter of choice. It's a matter of needing to do it. And as you said, with carbon credits, there's a cost of, especially if you're selling to Europe, there's an extra cost of doing business if you don't have enough carbon credits or to buy the carbon credit. So I think that's a must have. But a quick question, in the Singapore context, there is some accounting regulations coming up for sustainability. Could you share how does that work? What's the implication of that?
So I'm not very familiar with accounting. Are you talking about the disclosures for being listed, or are you talking about accounting in and of itself?
Yeah, there's a new accounting guideline coming in where one has to disclose there's a sustainability report which everybody needs to submit to SGX. But even from an accounting point of view, there's a new accounting standard coming up which has implications for accounting.
Okay, I'm not quite sure about that. I do know from the IFRS Foundation is working with the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, to develop new standards. But I haven't heard about new accounting principles, which maybe I can follow up and get back to you on that one.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Vivek. Vineet, go ahead.
Good afternoon. Thanks, Jade. So the question...
Oh, sorry, two Vineets.
this is the other Vineet. Okay.
Okay, okay. Go. Okay,
so in your starting remarks, you mentioned about the difference between Europe and Asia and many emerging countries lagging behind, which is quite natural. Mm. And we have seen already that there's a lot of tussle going on socially, between governments, between corporates, consumers and suppliers, etc. It's at all levels. In fact, I've been having debates with my counterparts. I'm in wealth management business. I've been having arguments with my counterparts in Europe about sustainability, involving sustainability in investing. And they're simple. They simply say, "Oh, we need it's a must." But I say, no, I don't care. Mm. Investors don't care, number one. And secondly, the reality on the ground in Asia is very different. And I'm not referring to Singapore, of course. I'm referring to the whole region as such. So specifically talking about climate and therefore the use of fossil fuels, we are way behind, right? So probably it would be great if you could share some experiences in terms of how you are seeing this, or what kind of exchanges are you seeing between European and Asian companies, and what are the pressures felt by the region, and and how this will play out in terms of the pressure coming from Europe and the Western world in general, and how the Asian corporates will slowly adapt to it, and what's the path towards essentially progress there.
So I think it's interesting if you're coming from wealth management. So the discussion around family offices are obviously very big in Singapore and in Asia. And what we're seeing is that the older generation of the family offices are quite hesitant to invest in ESG, and it's a bit of a slower conversation to get them along that journey. Going what Vivek said, the next generation, which is, I guess, more of the millennial generation, they're going to come in and they're going to invest. They're going to look at ESG as a principle for long-term investment, because that's what ESG and sustainability is. It's long-term investing. So from a family office discussion, Asia I hate using the word behind, but we're a bit behind what's happening in Europe. But the conversation is there. People are very interested. They want to learn about it. And I think that's another point, is we are tasked with teaching the environment and the ecosystem what this means, what the benefits are, and what the risks are if you don't do it. And that's where we are at in Asia. It's an educational piece of teaching and understanding, because people don't necessarily just want to invest in something if they don't really understand it and understand the risks and the opportunities that it presents. So from an asset manager, the stewardship and the engagement of companies is also very important, to understand what's material, because not all these conversations are material for the corporate or the company in question. So what is material, and how do a lot of asset managers have not taken a divestment approach. They are engaging and trying to bring companies forward, because what we found is if you divest, a private owner is going to buy it, it's out of the ecosystem, and you don't see what's happening to it. So it's better to engage, get that corporate or company to transition, and then you can also monitor and see how your economy is actually doing in terms of this journey.
Okay.
Jade, just to build on a couple of points you just touched upon, right? We've talked 2-3 times in this chat about millennials being more sensitive to environmental goals, etc. Does this hold for companies per se? Are older companies, is a 100-year-old company more resistant to ESG than maybe a 10-year-old company? Is that something, or is that really not, is there no correlation, or is that just people that are more sensitive as age goes on? And the other question really, sorry if I can just add on, is you talked about common regulations being evolved in at least the non-US markets. And is that going to end up penalizing Asia? Because if you're held to a standard that Europe is going to end up setting, and clearly Asia, as Vineet mentioned, is going to be a step behind, is that going to be a bad period when that common regulation kicks in?
So I'm going to go to your first point, and I saw Sean shaking his head. So I'm going to use Smollen, where I was. They're a 90-year-old organization, and they are not resistant. They're very forward-thinking. They are very purposeful. I think from the day they started, they were very purposeful. So it's very much part of their DNA. And a lot of these big organizations, it is part of their DNA, because they have been around for 100 years and they've had to adapt and make sure that their employees and the livelihoods are intact. Otherwise, they actually don't have a business to operate. So I don't think it's necessarily the age of the organization that would necessarily have that resistance. Your second point is a very valid point, and that's why we always inform and revert on public consultations in terms of regulation from an Asia perspective, from an Asian voice. And there is a working group of the Asian exchanges on ESG to see how, as a region, you can bring in those regulatory standards that are relevant to Asia. Your disclosures are always going to be the same, because I think the investor comparability globally is very important. And that's where we're all trying to get to, is how do we compare reports internationally to make our investment decisions, and that data needs to be consistent. But I think this goes back to the same thing. What's material in Asia is different to what's material in Europe. And that is very important. And I think that's where more of the focus needs to lie, because the standards will always be quite broad And then it's up to the organization to define what that means for them.
Thanks.
Yes, Rich.
Yeah, hi. My question is quite short. Can an Indonesian company buy carbon credits from a seller in Africa, i.e. from someone in a very different geographical zone? And if yes, why is that even allowed?
So yes, they can. The concept of carbon credits is because it's the atmosphere that covers the world. If you carbon here is carbon there. So it's been standard that you can buy carbon credits from anywhere in the world. A different concept is renewable energy credits, and that you can only buy within your jurisdiction. So renewable energy credits in Singapore are incredibly expensive because there's hardly any renewable energy in Singapore, and you cannot buy that from Indonesia, for example. Why is that allowed? It's a good question. I guess it's because you're offsetting, but then it goes back to the 6-step principles of decarbonization, where the science-based targets won't look at carbon credits in your decarbonization journey, because if you're an organization in Indonesia, you need to make sure that you are a responsible organization within Indonesia versus helping a responsible organization in Africa. And this is where the industry is trying to get to, is how do you make your national boundaries sustainable versus just casually buying offsets around the world.
Okay, thank you. I think we have run out of time. Hitansh, maybe your question can be taken up later. Sean, sure. I would like to just wrap it up because people also need to leave. Yeah.
Jade, just a really big thanks from us all. Wonderful to have a true subject matter expert come and share with us. Given the hands, and I'm sure there would have been way more if we had time, as we enter into a new Rotary year, it would be great if at some time you could avail yourself and we could continue with this conversation. I don't think this is a one-off. ESG is going to be with us for decades, and it will continue to evolve. And I think that we have to be responsible as organizations. I think as a Rotary organization, one of our 2 global initiatives has been in the eradication of polio. And for decades, Rotary's worked really hard to raise money, build awareness, and then go into polio markets. I think there's only 2 countries today where polio still hasn't come under control, hasn't been eradicated, and Rotary made a massive push, and I think contributed hugely to ensure that has happened. So going forward, it'd be wonderful if we could almost have you as a regular guest.
Love
to
that.
Keep us praised, keep us up to date, and just once again, thank you so much.
No, thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me. And I'd love to come back. I mean, I'm very passionate about this area, and every question that I also get given helps me think about things and challenges me. So no, I really appreciate it. I hope everyone has a good weekend.
Thank you, Sean. I think we have had a whole range of questions. Thank you so much. And now, if I may take permission from all of you to just take another 10-15 minutes, if that's okay, because we have a few project updates, and I'm just going to, okay. Let's start with the Hawker project. I'll invite Vineet to, talk about the Hawker project to start with. And then I have a couple of other updates. Yeah, go ahead, Vineet.
Sure, thanks. I had a slide I sent you. I'm not sure if you can share it. Otherwise, I can just come to it. So, so we are pretty much the portal which YQ had created, they've invested in a lot of stuff, is pretty much ready. And we've looked at 5 pickup points where we'll start the group by. And I'm not going through the details of this. We have discussed it earlier. Couple of things that we are looking for. Number one, I think they are looking to hire walkers, and I think they're planning to pay $12 to $15 an hour for people who are willing to walk and deliver. So if anybody, if you has connects, please reach out to Sonali or me. We can introduce, they're looking for people and struggling to get some. But the bigger thing from our involvement perspective is what we are trying to do is to see that to ensure that this pilot takes off at 5 locations for this online group buy that we're trying for the first time. What we're trying to see is if we can get YQ to deliver even if the minimum order quantities are not met, which means even if just 1 or 2 people order, we just ensure that the order is delivered and not rejected. Normally, they would say they need a minimum of 5 or people to order at the same time. And what we are trying to see is if we can therefore take care of the differential in cost. There is about, it's not a very high cost. There's about a $250 to $300 base cost that YQ would incur for the workers to take care of this project. And all the money may not get recovered if we are pushing them to just fulfill all orders, even if the group buy doesn't meet its minimum order quantity. And so what we are proposing is that for the first 2 weeks of the project, we subsidize that shortfall, if any, and that might be just $100 to $200 a week. It's not very large, but we probably subsidize that for a couple of weeks. And if it's really gaining traction, we'll take a call if we need to extend that by a couple of weeks more. The aim is really to make sure we are getting the habit going in the catchment area, that people get into the habit of ordering through YQ for the Alexandra Village Food Center. And because YQ is doing this at a very, very, very low cost, we are trying to see if we can actually help subsidize this for a short period. So this is just suggesting this to the team, that if we can say a yes to this, it's going to be, my assumption is $200 to $400 is what we're going to end up subsidizing. It's not a large amount for us, but it'll ensure that we are not letting any order go unfulfilled, and therefore give a larger chance for this whole initiative to take off. The aim is if it works for a month, then it should be sustainable, and then the hawkers just have an alternate channel of ordering through a lot of the organizations which are nearby. The other ask is to help propagate the idea. If you have connects in Alexandra Hospital, AIA, IKEA, Anchorage, Alexis, the other last 2 are condos, please reach out, and we will try to see if we can propagate this in those places to make sure that they actually utilize this new channel that we are offering to get hawker food delivered at their doorstep.
Any questions? Are there any questions? We can take that.
So Vineet, Sonali, has the launch date been finalized? I saw in the email it's still being discussed, right?
Yeah, we're just waiting for them to actually get the workers onboarded. And I think as soon as we do that, and we are looking for an official confirmation from those locations that yes, they're okay to have those delivery points finalized. So just a couple of small things left. But I think the target was to launch by end of this month. Looks like we must be on track for that.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, or we take it as something that we can support for a couple of weeks to start with, and then we'll take a call to extend. Yeah.
Okay. And we won't fundraise for this now. It's once we get to the actuals, and if there is genuinely a shortfall between their costs and what is being collected, then we'll come back and do that. But we may not end up needing it if it's successful from day one.
Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Okay. So I have one update on the ISCOS project. In the last meeting, I had shared that FRCS cannot do the matching because they have their own projects. So I spoke with ISCOS, and they also have a IPC entity in their fold, and they have agreed to actually do the matching. So now we will put in the application, and then we can fundraise only after a month. So it looks like from the timelines, it will spill over. And so, Jacqueline, I would request you to get involved and take this project forward. I will obviously be there, supporting. But in terms of timelines, I think the fundraise can only happen a month after we submit the application for matching to Toad Board. So that's the update on ISCOS. Next month, we have a vocational visit planned. So we will not have a VSC meeting as such next month. Maybe we'll have a sort of get together and party. We'll figure that out. But yeah, thank you everyone for this journey. And let me ask PP Allen if he has any update to share on EYA. You need to unmute PP Allen.
Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, now for EYA, okay, the latest update is, okay, now we are going to start the site interview somewhere around June. Okay, slightly pushed backwards from May to June. of course, the secretary is trying to finalize all the participants, and we want to start to do the site interview maybe from June onwards. Okay, now as far as the gala dinner is concerned, I updated the club. I mean, I updated the last meeting that it's going to happen around November, but it may be a bit pushed backwards even into January, because I think Ritz-Carlton is very, very fully jam-packed with all the bookings flooding in. And even though we have pre-booked certain dates, but we are all on waiting list. So I just want to update the committee that we may even end up having an EY dinner maybe only in January for 2023. Okay, I mean, let's keep finger crossed. The secretary is working on it, and I think, yeah, that's my update.
Yeah.
As far as candidates concerned, we have currently about, we are seeing about maybe 16 to 7 candidates to be interviewed. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, PP Allen.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyone wants to share anything else? Any thoughts? Jacqueline, do you want to say something about your plans for the coming year? Okay, let me not put you on the spot. Okay, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be good if I could just say that thank you, Sonali, for guiding me on this BSc. Looking forward to, of course, hoping that the existing committee can continue to serve and to write this out together, because I'm relatively new in this area. And of course, I hope to work closely with all of you here. Yeah, so yeah, that's all for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Okay, we have some very senior members as part of BSc, and I'm sure they will be around to support. I think all of us are also there to support.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was an amazing conversation, and I hope we will be able to invite her back. Thank you, Sean, for organizing this and for doing this while having COVID or just recovering from COVID. Thank you so much.
Yeah, speedy recovery.
Thank you. Speedy recovery.
Yeah, speedy recovery, Sean.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a great weekend.
You too.
And see you all. I'm back in Singapore next week eventually. So take care.
See you hopefully next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Thank you everyone for joining.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks to Chair.
Bye-bye.
Thanks to Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonali.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.